Yeah, there's a lot I want to address that you were talking about there, but what do you think? And again, I can't emphasize enough the frustration that in your point about for our government to work, even at maybe a level in which we find unsatisfactory, but for it to work at all, the idea that Pelosi is not bringing back Congress during this, like, how much worse does it have to get? And I think it's indicative, like you say, of their agendas are not as divergent as they want us to believe. And I'm not saying this of all Democrats. I mean, I think you could literally put anyone in that position and it would be better for the left. Someone who could barely find the office, someone who was like, honestly, because it's just, she is very adept and skilled, but she is deploying that adeptness and that skill in a way that is harming the interests, I personally think, long-term of the Democratic Party, but more specifically of the great, like a huge swath of our population, and I don't think that the argument that it is a way to win elections is valid, particularly at this stage when you have Republicans that basically conceding the House. I'm not convinced it would have been even if they were contesting it.
Right.
But we don't need to go. I can stipulate that argument and say, like, well, the evidence is that no, that argument's irrelevant at this point. Like the idea.
Well, you hit on this earlier too, when you were talking about the frontline members abandoning Pelosi to side with the progressives. Like, she grounds her decisions supposedly in their needs, right? And they've come out publicly saying, like,
we're not going to be your fig leaf here.
Exactly.
But there's also, even if that wasn't the case, at one point, like, a functioning democracy is in instances more important than near-term election results. Now, I happen to think that they are probably aligned, but I also think that they also could be decoupled, and you could actually challenge Donald Trump in a meaningful way, and not like inspire voters to go like, well, wait a second, I was going to vote for Joe Biden, but now Nancy Pelosi is concerned about these random federal special black op, we don't know who they are, cops. I mean, I was just saying, like, can you imagine if there were half a dozen Congress people, just a half a dozen, in that square when they're cleaned out by the federal police forces? Like, what are the implications of I'm not a Hakeem Jeffries fan, but like, I can understand where Nancy Pelosi says, well, I'm not sure I can go into a protest because of my age. Okay. I think she can afford a personal security force around her, but like, I don't know, Hakeem Jeffries is in the leadership of the House. Can you imagine if he was in there, during this assault that they were attacking, journalists? I mean, they're not even doing the politics on their own terms correctly.
Right.
And that, I think, is what is a big giveaway.
And I think you're really helpfully disaggregating for people the difference between politics and policy. And one of the things as a candidate that I've been, in some respects, surprised by, I knew when I first ran in 2018 that politics is unfortunately little about the principle that has attracted me as an advocate to fighting for my neighbors' rights over the last 20 years. And I knew that it has a lot to do, unfortunately, with the power plays that Nancy Pelosi is so skilled in. I was disappointed and remain still, frankly, surprised by how much of politics is ultimately merely performance. And that's what Pelosi is really, really good at. She's great at fooling an entire party into thinking that she's fighting on behalf of them. And one of the reasons she's able to do that is because corporate media sources and right-wing media sources in particular depict her as a lion of the left. And it's interesting who depicts her as a lion of the left. You'll never find a leftist or a progressive say that, but you'll get MSNBC and Fox News. The one thing they can agree on is that Nancy Pelosi is supposedly some, liberal champion.
San Francisco politics. Right. Like, I mean, it's, it's the Castro. It's essentially like she's built this brand on the Castro, as it were, for nationally. And that,
claiming work she didn't do. I mean, just
right.
to be clear there, like I fought for gay rights when she did not.
But
I know that she doesn't have the receipt.
Right. But I'm talking like she just, without even the actual involvement, it's literally the pictures of the Castro, which she's allowed to sort of define her politics as a progressive, because like I represent, a district where, guys are on floats wearing chaps, and that, she gets to communicate that I'm a progressive, therefore, because Sean Hannity and a bunch of lunatics on the right, that's the way they define it.
Right. And then on politics, or pardon me, policy, if that's the performative construction of who she is, and she relies on her constituents for her legitimacy as a liberal person, her policies consistently have been conservative, right? Yep. I mean, you can't give a criminal tyrant $4.5 billion for concentration camps on our nation's borders and call yourself liberal. You can't approve the world's most gargantuan, obscene military budget and call yourself liberal. You can't suppress evidence of CIA human rights abuses and call yourself liberal, or engineer a mass incarceration framework that is a travesty, an open air, long-standing travesty in human rights, long preceding the recent uprising, and call yourself liberal. I mean, and Nancy Pelosi, or be an architect of the mass surveillance state, I could go on. Like she an authoritarian, not a liberal.
I can't remember. Was it 3 or 4 months ago? She was literally bragging that despite the desire to impeach George Bush, she was the one who basically, I mean, it's like, it was almost, had she been talking about, these protests, or had she been talking like, but it was like, literally she was saying like, I threw my body in between the desire to impeach George Bush. And I am very proud. I mean, like literally the glee in which she was sort of talking about that was shocking, just shocking. And it is, you cannot, and I think like, you made this point about 20 years ago with what happened at the Supreme Court. You cannot have these rolling series of unaccountability. And maybe we go back to savings and loan. We go back to Iran Contra. We can go back even further. You cannot have these series of rolling lack of accountability without it beginning to aggregate and beginning to, because when she just sends a letter to Donald Trump and says, we need to know where these people are from, the message to Donald Trump is, I can get away with a little bit more. And maybe it's not Donald Trump, maybe it's Bill Barr.
Yep.
And maybe it's not even, maybe it's Bill Barr, maybe it's the the federal prison in California that says, we can send our best guys out there. We'll bring, our thumpers or whatever we call them, and we'll send them out there. If you
normalizes it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And so, all right.
Can I pull on one thread that you laid out there, particularly about the recurring lack of accountability? There's one era of that pattern that's particularly relevant to the police violence we're talking about now that doesn't come up much in discussions about it. And this is the story that was revealed by Gary Webb. And I know you're onto this, like the CIA's role in domestic policing, in mass incarceration, and the militarization of police. We are responding at the moment to a crisis in policing. Few people have traced it to its root. And you mentioned the Iran-Contra era. One of the unfortunate and widely overlooked parts of that saga was what the CIA later admitted in the 90s, that it denied when the Iran-Contra scandal was going down under the Reagan administration. But we found out later that the CIA, in fact, was running drugs into LA and Miami to fund its rogue foreign policy abroad. What happened as a result? Cops started dying in US streets. And what happened as a result? We started arming cops to the teeth like militaries. The paramilitarization of police in the United States historically traces a direct line to the war on drugs that the CIA started and has never paid a price for. What happened after that? They started torturing detainees to the point of rape and murder. What happened after that? They started murdering US citizens abroad using robots piloted from thousands of miles away. The Criminal Intelligence Agency is the hole in the bucket of our democracy. We can't have human rights around the world until we close it. And we can't even have any meaningful pretense of democracy until we at least get the opportunity to see into the agency's secrets. Even its bottom line budget is classified. Yep. And I would ask anyone anywhere, maybe particularly Speaker Pelosi, to give me even a single good reason for that. There's no operational details disclosed in a budget number. What it would give us, the American people, is some insight into how badly we're being fleeced. And we have no idea. And that's not just Donald Trump's fault. That's Speaker Pelosi's fault. And when we look at policing, we can't just think it's the police department. We have to unwind the whole edifice. And that goes all the way to Langley, Virginia. I have a whole song about this, Ferguson to Jerusalem, that's kind of like a hip hop history lesson about the interconnections between international incidents of police violence. But this particular piece, the agency's role in contriving domestic police militarization, most people don't get it, don't see it. And I have never heard a member of Congress actually do anything about that. And that's a big part of why I'm running for Congress and not City Hall. People ask me all the time, why aren't you running for the school board or the board of supervisors or, the state assembly? I can't fight the NSA and the CIA from those offices. And all I've ever done is fight the NSA and the FBI. And I frankly want to do something about the CIA and ICE and CBP. And I see members in Congress who have those concerns, but not the depth and the expertise to do it. I've been doing that work as an advocate at the national level for a generation. The last time I got a chance to ask questions in Congress, they arrested me for it. And I'm eager to get some answers to these questions.
I mean, I have to say that in my personal experience with Congress people, and frankly, some senators, they don't seem to know much about much. I mean, I'm not being flip. I mean,
I hear you.
Like there is,
it's true.
You grow up and you have perceptions of adults are competent. And then when you're an adult, you have perceptions that your leaders are competent. And I have sat down with a lot of politicians to talk to them about, both on camera and off camera, or on air and not air, whatever it is. And it is really disturbing to walk away from some of the conversations and understand. And, part of it is a function of they spend a lot of time fundraising. And so they don't necessarily spend a lot of time educating themselves about the issues that they're dealing with. And if somebody's showing up with here's a brief, read a half a page of this and you'll understand this issue. Well, that person's coming from the agency that they're supposed to be overseeing, or that person's coming from the industry that they're overseeing, but it's very convenient. And folks who are critics of those things don't have the access or the resources to provide that other half page. And they're inclined to believe those people because they're of a similar ilk. And this is the dynamic that they're, and then there's also a lot of them who are just plain old, not bright. And I mean, that's just the reality of it. And, which is frankly, when you have someone like AOC in office, her politics are right. As far as I'm concerned, her sense of politics and her sense of policy to continue that sort of dichotomy there are right. Yep. She's also incredibly intelligent and
so sharp.
I mean, I had a chance to get to know Al Franken pretty well before he went to the Senate. And I'm quite convinced, without litigating the issues that led him out of the Senate, I certainly didn't know anything about that before then, but on the day he showed up in the Senate, he was probably the top five and most informed senators on day one. And that was, other people who were there was supposedly with resources. And so I think we cannot underestimate the value of putting a couple of smart people into our legislative branches. And all right, well, look, here's what we're going to do. I also wanted to ask you, was Pam Karlan she's one of my favorite law professors.
She's amazing. I had a chance to take 2 courses with her at Stanford. And there were a couple of professors. Pam Karlan was one, Lawrence Lessig was another. Morton Horowitz was maybe a third, who I really feel like turned my mind inside and out and reforged it. And I frankly don't think I'd be the same if I didn't have the opportunity to learn at their feet. And I everything from the subject matter to also, the way they conducted. Pam Karlan's always been on the front line. She was litigating to vindicate voting rights at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. When Bush versus Gore happened, it was her that I took the course from to learn about the background in the court's decision and unpack, just how illegitimate it was in all the many dimensions. And particularly with her, I would see, a value and a style of public advocacy that includes not just legal acumen, but, wit and the opportunity to inform our analysis with our norms and our values. I saw her demonstrate that with Lessig in particular. One of the things I saw from him was just this very deep structural critique and an ability to transcend abstractions and to locate both in the specific and in the abstract these dynamics that often elude us when we look at, it's like the difference between seeing a forest and trees, and he's able to see both at the same time. And I kind of learned that from him. And Morton Horowitz gave me a sense of legal history that I don't think I would have picked up earlier or otherwise. And particularly understanding, among the things I learned from him was how far the Democratic Party has abandoned the roots of its ideology during the FDR era. Pam Carlin, actually, I the same article where I proposed to end judicial life tenure in order to guard judicial independence. This was in 2010 in an article called Bush versus Gore, Part 4. And you check on the court to restore the rule of law. In that same piece, where I basically said that 18-year staggered terms for Supreme Court justices would be a better way to depoliticize the court without reintroducing another bias, a way basically to fix the court under Kavanaugh and Roberts and Alito and Gorsuch. In that same article, I proposed that Pam Carlin should have gotten the seat that then later ended up going to Sotomayor. I think she'd be an incredible Supreme Court.
I was just going to say, if Barack Obama was the person that, like on the, when all the stuff with Reverend Wright came out, and I was like, oh, maybe this, like, that was the thing that I was like, well, because prior to that, I was like, well, Clinton, Obama, 6-1, half dozen. But then I was like, oh, Reverend Wright, maybe he's like, that's how I would do it. Do couple of years in the state Senate, do 2 years as a senator before I have to take any votes, come out, run for president. But it turns out that I think actually, I believe Obama, that he was never in this pew and didn't hear any of that stuff. But if Obama was the guy that we wanted him to be, Pam Carlin would be on the Supreme Court right now.
Exactly.
And
if I can press on that for a minute, I spent 3 years at the American Constitution Society. I co-founded the student chapter when I was a student there. And then from 2005 to 2008, I was on the national senior staff. And a big part of the project then was building a pipeline of progressive jurists for the next Democratic president to appoint. And when, Obama even hired a senior person from our organization into the White House and then basically shredded the list. He appointed one person from it to the Ninth Circuit, Goodwin Liu. He didn't get confirmed in the Senate. The administration didn't go to bat for him. They abandoned his nomination and then started appointing prosecutors of color, claiming that was their mandate. We're going to keep appointing prosecutors. We're just going to make sure they're diverse. It's the same thing as putting Gina Haspel at the CIA.
Yes.
It's not any better when the human rights abusers are women and people of color. That degree of tokenism is even worse than exclusion in the first place.
I feel like we could do like another episode on this, because after Liu lost that seat, it basically made the ACS, because the idea was the Federalist Society is basically your ticket to you have your, like, a sort of a corporate structure there. You work your way up in the Federalist Society. That's an imprimatur that gets you through the door, as opposed to what it really should be completely toxic. But what happened with the ACS is that became toxic. And then it was a liability for you to be associated with the ACS in the same way that they were successful in doing that with the ACLU. And that's how how Dabo got rejected from the civil rights division of the DOJ. Yep. They are able to take left-wing institutions, be they as they may,
even when they're not left-wing.
That's what I'm saying. Like ostensibly left-wing institutions, and make them toxic. And so they have successfully undermined, and I know we're getting far afield here, but this is one of my sort of favorite topics, so people will indulge me. They have undermined the ability for the left to even have structures in which to inject personnel, particularly in this instance, judges. But I mean, I think we have that deficit. I think broadly speaking, there is no left-wing cap, because they're not going to take money from Dubai or whatever it is to build the institution that you need to feed these organizations. I mean, I'm curious. I've spoken to Brian Fallon, who is one of the most interesting figures in my mind coming out of the Obama administration, because he has set up an organization, and they're one of their first proclamations. And I have no real way of assessing, how deep this runs, but was no more corporate lawyers as judicial picks.
Mm,
And his organization is trying to build a list
I like that.
and trying to get there. And he was out of the Obama administration. I think he saw what went down and was not happy with it. And I just saw him tweet something to the effect of like defund the police. And I was like, that
Coming out of Obama, that's big. Yeah. Brian
that's,
Fallon. I'm gonna have to look him up.
yes. Oh yeah. No, you should check into that. All right.